moderator is Nancy Genova, and she will introduce the panelists that we have from Lehman College to talk to us about microaggressions.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nancy Genova. I work in the Behavioral and Social Sciences Department in the Public Policy and Law Unit. I teach public administration. I'm the sole full-time public administration professor at Hostos. We have several courses in public administration that are writing intensive, so you could encourage your students fundamentals of public administration, state and local government, and federal administration. I don't know if there's anyone left here from Allied Health, but very grateful to Allied Health who refers a lot of your students to our courses, so thank you so much. So today I'm part also of the Affirmative Action Committee here at Hostos, and this was something that members brought up at one of our meetings a while ago in terms of workplace microaggressions. And so these panelists, who happen to also be CUNY professors at Lehman College, so graciously accepted our invitation to be here today, and this is the area of expertise. So I want to first introduce to you Dr. Jermaine Monk, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work at Lehman College. Prior to his appointment at CUNY, Dr. Monk has taught at several universities, including Temple, Rutgers, and Drew. Upon graduation with his MSW, Dr. Monk worked for 4 years in HIV/AIDS case management, crisis intervention, and foster care case management in Pennsylvania and New York. Dr. Monk earned his BA in Urban Studies from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in New Brunswick. He received an MSW from Temple University and an MA in Theological Studies from LaSalle University, both in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Monk completed his MA and PhD in Urban Systems from Rutgers. And Dr. Brenda Williams-Gray is an associate professor and the undergraduate program director at Lehman College in Social Work Department, where she teaches in both the undergraduate and master's program courses, practice, youth and behavioral self, supervision, and administration. She has 20 plus years of clinical and supervisory and leadership experience in social services agencies, including work with children and families with emotional and behavior challenges. Research interests and expertise are in the areas of trauma and resiliency, cultural diversity, organizational capacity, and social work education and leadership. She is the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal on Urban Social Work. So without further ado, here is our expert panel.
Can you hear me? In the back, can you hear me? Okay. I had this fantasy. Okay. So good afternoon. It's always tricky to do the workshop after lunch because everybody's kind of in a lull. So hopefully we'll be able to engage you and get out of that lull. Let me not block the 2 screens. This is a nice room, 2 screens. We're at Lehman. I don't know of any room that's got 12 screens. Okay. So Professor Monk and I have done completed one study on microaggressions in students, and we're actually in the middle of starting another study on the same topic. So it's an area that's dear to our heart. So we have some goals, and we're to end at about 1:35, am I correct? Okay, so native Bronx girl, I talk fast. So stop me if you need me to slow down. We want to make a mention of the literature on microaggressions. We're not going to spend as much time on that. We want to talk about microaggressions in the workplace because people think that they don't happen. And more importantly, people don't know what to do about them when they do happen. And we just want to increase your awareness about the range on microaggressions. There's a lot of things, you know, for a long time people talked about being politically correct, or not knowing how to approach people, or not knowing the difference between really making an honest inquiry about somebody's culture versus doing what folks consider a microaggression. I have a couple of personal favorite microaggressions when people go to me, "Oh, you're so articulate." I want to say compared to what? You've never seen a black woman who can conjugate a verb and put a period in a sentence and know the difference between a comma and a semicolon. So oftentimes microaggressions, when we talk about them, you'll realize that some things seem innocuous, some things seem like naivete, but there are some hidden messages.
So we're going to tag team. So we're going to go back and forth. So I'm going to manage the electronic system. So I'll be stationed here. The definition. So this comes from Stewart et al. This is really the crux of how we started our study and becomes the crux of our presentation for today. So Stewart et al. They define microaggressions as such. It's brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults to the target person or group. One of the things that I will say is that in our study and in our research, that we've expanded that to not just include race. So we're going to talk about that as we move forward. So this isn't so much a black or white or Latino thing. This includes other isms, and we're going to talk about that as we move forward.
One of the things that Sue, who's out of Columbia, he's somewhat famous for really doing some of the work on microaggressions that everybody pays attention to, but a gentleman named Chester Pierce, back in the 70s, was really the first person to label it. I see you nodding, so you're familiar with it, and to identify that microaggressions really come from a systemic effort a la Jim Crow to really keep folks down and to make sure that people who are perceived as powerless remain powerless and, more importantly, voiceless in the greater socio-political context. And given the fun that we're going to be engaging in 2020 with this election, and I use the word fun in the most dishonest way, we'll be seeing it. So in relation to, so somebody could comment on how many times I managed to survive this without raising the 2020 election. It's always the thing that I'm struggling with as I teach, and how do I create a space for people to talk about that which is difficult, promise that people can have differing views and seething over some of the things that are going on politically. So it's my personal academic schizophrenia so that I could avoid continuing traumatic stress disorder. But in any event, I digress. The categories of microaggressions. We're going to talk about the different types and label them so people understand. When we talk about trauma, one of the things that Judith Herman did so well was help people who were traumatized label what was happening to them, and knowing what you call something helps you manage it better. So the labels are not only just to look cute, they're really to help people understand the different types of microaggressions. So the first category are the micro insults. And these are behavioral verbal remarks or comments that generally convey rudeness or insensitivity or demean somebody's race or identity. Of all of the categories, this is the one that seems to be the least in your face, usually associated with sort of a ha-ha or a bit of sarcasm. Whereas micro assaults are often conscious. So while micro insults may be unconscious, micro assaults, someone knows what they're doing. And those are explicit racial, derogatory characteristics, and oftentimes attached to violent verbal or nonverbal insults. And interestingly, when we did our research, which we did with college students, it was amazing how many different types of these experiences they had. Now, micro-invalidations, when you think about validation, again, these are more often unconscious. They're verbal comments or behaviors that really seek to nullify or negate the feelings or thoughts of the person's reality. So when you experience a microaggression and you talk about it to someone, and they're like, nah, that's not what they really meant, or you're looking more into it, or why do you always have to bring up this is about being a woman, or this is being about race? So it's the response that people have to your experience of a microaggression that this has. Now, the category not listed here that Sue speaks to, and this comes from his literature, is environmental microaggressions. And part of the reason why we don't spend as much time on that is because that's more macro systems, and most of our research is specifically microsystems and person to person. But there's an oxymoron calling it a microaggression when it's part of a macro level assault. Think Flint. That's an environmental microaggression, but I think in our next go around we're going to call it an environmental macroaggression. And these are not only racial assaults and insults that invalidate, but it's done on a more systemic level across systems and across environmental pieces.
So the literature is extensive on microaggressions. There's been a lot that has been done in terms of the research area related to microaggression. As I stated before, there's been a lot done specifically based upon race, right? And race is one of those things that we, at least historically, one of those things that we can tell one person from another, black from white or Latino or Asian, what have you, right? And in an evolving society, there's been new research or expanding research that have included other isms that arguably still apply to microaggressions, right? So even though the literature on microaggressions started with race, obviously in today's day and age, that is expanded, and that includes obviously gender, sexuality, class, and disability. And part of that concept is that you can experience a microaggression not just based upon race, but it can be based upon any one of these isms. Right? As a society, just generally speaking, we assume people to be heterosexual, right? Think about as we're raising sons and daughters. If they're going to the prom, if you have a son, one of the questions may be, what's her name? There's the assumption that your son is heterosexual, therefore he's going to bring a female. If you have a female child, then that she's heterosexual, she's going to bring a male child. That's the point. Right, so that's this idea that the slight doesn't have to be based upon an ism that we assume to be a difference. It can be something that the assumption that we are assuming is something that we think is traditional. This is the way it's supposed to be. This is what we consider to be normal. And outside of that context, you have these other various forms of microaggressions, and that's just some. Another good one that we actually talk about, especially in social work, we think about disabilities. Think about you have a building when there's no elevator, and we often think about, especially in a university setting or college setting, what if you have a student who is physically disabled and there's no physical way for them? If your class is on the second floor, how are they supposed to get from the first floor to the second floor if there's no elevator? So some things that we may not think about in terms of how that could be a form of a microaggression. There may be things that we give in terms of assignments, and we automatically assume that students are thinking cognitively or thinking in a way that we think is normal, right? In terms of taking notes, etc. Right? There's other ways of learning, and how do we incorporate that into our teaching?
I just want to interpret an example. So I had a student who, because sometimes physical disabilities aren't always obvious. So we snarl at people if they take the handicap spot because we can't tell what their disability is. But we have an elevator in the building that we're in, and anybody who identifies as having a physical disability gets the elevator key. Well, that's lovely, so we had a fire drill. So we were on the second floor. So myself and two other students had to help a student go down, the concrete steps in these buildings, down 2 flights of those concrete steps, because even though she had the elevator key, we had not accounted for the fire drill. So in the next cycle, we had to look at the classrooms in a different way. And what Jermaine is really speaking to is the concept of intersectionality. And those of you who pay attention to intersectionality, which is increasingly becoming more visible in the literature, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a lawyer, spoke about that and really developed that out of the differences between both gender and race, and how we are not just one thing. We are layered with all of our identities. What generation are you in? Nancy and I were talking as we went to the ladies' room. I'm sorry, I'm going to out our age a little bit. That when Professor Monk and I were looking for the building, because I've only been in the other building, I hadn't been in this building, and I kept saying, it's the Savoy multi-purpose room. I said, my mother used to go to a place called the Savoy Ballroom. I remember her telling me stories about dancing at the Savoy Ballroom. I said, it's got to be that way because that's where the ballroom is. So that puts me in a certain age. So we have generational kinds of things. That's all I do about age. I dye the hair. I lie about it and all of this. But when we look at our occupations, when we look at both gender, immigration status, and ethnicity, we realize that we are layered in who we are. It's why when they do, okay, here's number 2 on the 2020 thing. It's why when they do those surveys on who you're gonna vote for, I'm always amused because they're like, women are gonna vote for, so ding. But black people are gonna vote for, so then I ding here. But people of this age are gonna vote for, so I ding this age here. People who are interested in social justice and social work issues are gonna vote for, so I ding this way here. I'm like, they don't know who I'm gonna vote for. Because, but the desire to put people into boxes when we are certainly more complex, nuanced, and layered causes these kinds of problems. You have a wonderful example, which when you're not doing this with me, I tell on your behalf, so I'm not going to do that because do you know what I'm talking about?
I do.
Oh, good.
I often give the example in class and also in these types of presentations, and I was going to give it, is that there's intersectionality in a number of ways. One, race, gender, class, you can also say educational status. What I tell students is on campus, I am Dr. Mark. I can walk around campus, the CUNY police officers are not going to stop me. I can go into any building. I am assumed that I deserve to be there. However, when I leave and I get in my car and I drive back to New Jersey, that is not the assumption. I make sure that my seatbelt is on, that I'm at 10 and 2, and because of the car that I drive and how my car looks, I understand that I could be stopped. And I'm saying that to say that that has happened several times. And I tell my students that nobody cares that I'm Dr. So-and-so, that I'm on such and such campus, that I've been doing this for X number of years, because I realize that what they see first is who I am and the skin that I'm in, right? And also the vehicle I'm in or the neighborhood that I'm in, and that matters. And one of the things that I think about in terms of how I was raised is that I want to get home, right? So all those things that I need to do in order to make sure that I am safe, I abide by in that moment. But I let students know that the person that I show up in, or show how I show up in the classroom, is really because this space allows me to do that. However, that space or how I show up isn't necessarily respected or regarded once I leave this space. And part of that becomes this understanding that how I may move in one particular environment is not the same way that I'm allowed to move in another environment. And how that becomes important in terms of survival, in terms of moving on to and getting places safely and so forth and so on.
So what Professor Monk is talking about is situational privilege. Privilege that is only specific to a particular environment as opposed to privilege that's specific to who you are. And the students that we have in the Bronx include many students who are first generation, many students who are struggling with issues regarding immigration, and students who may have family members or who themselves come from places that say be quiet, don't be seen. And what are we all trying to do with our students? Get them to find their own voice, find their own way, be out there. So we're oftentimes up against students who are behaving in ways to support their survival, and we're trying to unravel that without really knowing that we're interfering with major issues for them. And that's part of the lesson for faculty around some of these microaggressions. So I'm going to do the second half of this page.
I'll finish this one.
You're going to finish this one? Okay.
So just really quick, I want to make sure everybody can hear, I'm sorry, is the bonding mechanism. So out of the study that we conducted relative to this particular topic with students and microaggressions, there were some things that came out. So if you experience a microaggression, micro assault, or insult, invalidation, what do? Right? So what are some of the coping mechanisms? That's one of the things that we wanted to find out, is what you do in those situations. One is bonding together. An example of that is basically if there are a number of people who are experiencing that at that same time, they may kind of group together, confer with one another, kind of check with each other to see, did we just witness what just happened, that type of thing, right? Another, you may have somebody who's a group spokesperson, so there may be someone in the group who says, you know what, I'm going to talk out for us, that type of thing. confronting the perpetrator, actually saying something to the person who's doing or saying the thing that is considered to be insensitive or derogatory. Another is silence. So we had some students who actually just didn't say anything because they didn't know how to respond. They were shocked, they were surprised, and because it could have been a power dynamics. For example, if a faculty member says something to a classroom, because they're the student, they may not feel empowered to actually say something to the faculty member or to the administrator. The other is we looked at some protective factors for resiliency, which we're going to get into a little bit later.
Okay. So we broke down the different themes, messages, and examples from microaggressions, and that's just a page telling you what the rest of this is. That's all I have to say about that. So the first one is alien in one's own land, and when Sue talked about this, he said, oftentimes people assume that if you're Asian born or if you're Latin American, you're assumed to be foreign. And his example has always been when people say, so where are you from? And he says, Seattle. And then someone says, no, but where are you really from? And he says, Seattle. So there's this idea that if you have an accent, if you are not white, that you come from someplace else. When in fact we know that the only people who are indigenous to this country are the Native Americans. So everybody came from someplace else some way or another. So part of that is the idea, and the message is, you don't really belong here, you're an interloper, you didn't start out here. So it's a one-downing position.
The next one is description of intelligence, assigning intelligence to a person of color on the basis of their race. Oftentimes, I've experienced that, and many of you in the room may have experienced that. And as a person of color who identifies as black, it is a very interesting experience when you are surrounded with folks who are supposed to be just as smart as you. Right? So we all are faculty members in terms of experiences that I've had. I can go into, or I've had experiences, I named one experience, I'm not going to name the institution, but I will give the experience. I started at an institution, and I guess just a brief background, I'm the first person in my family to graduate high school, to go to college, to get a master's degree, to get a doctorate degree, so forth and so on. And I say that to say that when I enter the classroom, I understand some of the challenges that many students of color may face as they move up the academic ladder. One, because of what I've just experienced, and I understand from the students' experiences, their own, some of the things that they told me about what they had to endure. So at this particular institution, I'm going through the semester, and one of the things I like to do is I like to increase the students' lexicon, right? So vocabulary. And I'll use the word lexicon, I'll go over it with the class, what does it mean, let's write it down, make sure that everybody understands, but part of it is including or increasing their vocabulary. Very basic stuff. I had a colleague come to me and say, well, you're using too many big words and you're intimidating students. And I said, interesting. It made me really reflect, it was told to me that I'm doing a student a disservice because I'm trying to increase their vocabulary, at least that's my intention. How it's perceived, though, was that I was actually trying to intimidate them and make them feel stupid. And I really had to reflect on that, and I had to talk to other colleagues to say, am I reading this wrong? Am I doing something where I need to change the way that I am functioning in the classroom? And it was brought to my attention that this conversation happens in other faculties. So other faculty bring up these conversations or bring up these terms. However, no other faculty, specifically faculty who don't look like me, have ever been told that this is seen as being intimidating to students. However, this was definitely told to me my first year at this institution. And I really had to reflect, and I'm dealing with a lot of students who come from immigrant populations or black or brown or women, and I'm thinking I am trying to really raise the bar, but in doing so, now I'm being perceived as that you are coming up as, uppity, arrogant, snobbish, you're trying to talk down to our students, and I'm really trying not to internalize that. And that's one of those things in terms of a description of intelligence. I can't use big words because now you're trying to be more than you are. And that's an example of, in terms of really trying to understand what that feels like when you're surrounded with people who are supposed to be just as scholarly and educated as you are. And that's what I mean. It's trying to really understand that experience to see, is that something that everybody experiences or just some people?
One of the students who responded in our survey spoke about being at work and having her supervisor saying, "You're smart for being a Mexican." So just think of that they took an entire country and nationality and implied that because this student was going to college while she was working, that was outside of his stereotype or norm for thinking about people who are Mexican. Another student who was talking to a student about their grade on a test, and the student who was inquiring assumed that she had the higher grade. And as they were talking back and forth, she asked the student, who was a young black woman, "So what did you get?" And when she said an A, the student didn't even have the filter to just say, "Oh." She said, "I didn't know that black people did so well." She said it out loud. So, I'm always struck by when people say things out loud, and they're not drunk. I'm sorry, I know you're telling me. Because some people think that if you're on a substance, more of your guts come out. But she said that out loud with no filter, as if it was an acceptable thing to say, let alone the fact that she thought it. Color blindness. Okay, so this is a tricky one. Some people want that whole kumbaya, "I don't see your color, I only see you." Okay, when I walked in this room and stood up here, you all saw a whole bunch of things. You all saw that I was short and I was silly enough to have flats on, okay? You saw that I need glasses, so that tells you something. Now, I know we're in a gender fluid society, so we can't make easy assumptions about who people are from a gender perspective, but I at least present as a woman. So you could take that leap. And I've got brown skin, and that could mean a whole host of things. But the idea that you would say you don't see my color, well, I want you to see my womanness. I want you to hear how I speak and what that may mean. Why would I want you not to see my color? Why would I want to leave out that part of me that includes a whole cultural, nuanced sense of who I am? So when we say we don't see color, what we're saying is we know it's not okay to acknowledge that people have differences. The fact that we have differences doesn't mean that we don't have similarities. And yes, we certainly should focus on more about similarities. We all bleed red. So there's certainly a lot to be said, but for not only focusing on the differences. But when we make the differences toxic, or make them have to be something that's not said out loud, we add a layer of discomfort to the dialogue. So I hope we are all seen in all of our many splendors. I don't believe we're a melting pot. If you make a melting pot, everything just looks blonde gray. But if you make a salad, you can still see the tomatoes, you can still see the mushrooms. They mingle together very nicely, but all the parts are still there. Why do we have to disown any of our parts just to join with other people? But oftentimes, when folks are trying to justify that they're not racist or sexist or homophobic, they say they don't see whatever that thing is. That's always a little trick to me.
Denial of individual racism, sexism, or heterosexism. A statement made when a person denies their racial or gender or heterosexual biases and privilege. This kind of goes back to the point that I was making before regarding like if you have a male child or a female child and you assume who their date is going to be for prom, or it could be a colleague, right? Assuming you see a wedding band, you assume that if it's a man, that man is married to a woman, or vice versa. It becomes this idea that we may not recognize the privileges that we have, right? I myself obviously I do identify as a black male, but in doing so, I recognize that I still have privilege. I have privilege in certain ways, however, I recognize that their privilege may not be, it's not the same. For example, men, generally speaking, even if you're a man of color, you have male privilege, which in a sense does counter female privilege. So females may have privilege in certain ways and men have privilege in other ways. For example, if I were to walk into a classroom, I talked with Brenda about this particularly, especially when it comes to confrontations with students. Students may challenge a I think that they actually challenge male professors more, especially male professors of color, than they would a female professor. And part of that is that I'm in social work. So social work, a lot of our students are females. So one of the things is that they may be able to relate more with their female faculty member versus when I enter the room. Now, that challenge though may come in the form of like a grade appeal or challenging or a particular assignment, what have you. But in terms of actual in class, we've actually talked about that. You've had some more challenges, I think, in terms of actual students saying something in the class, where in my class they may not do so. So part of it is that you recognize that even though you may be a person of color, you may have a disability, you may be part of the LGBT community, that doesn't mean that you don't have privilege. That privilege may still exist, and that privilege can be used in certain areas, and that's kind of like the situational privilege that you were talking about earlier.
I had a colleague who said, I didn't realize that I had heterogenic privilege because it didn't occur to me. And that's what happens. Whatever privilege you have, you take for granted. It doesn't occur to you that it's different than what someone else has. He says, when you say your husband, people assume that you know, he goes, I have to think about whether I say my partner. People use that as code words because we have code words for everything. People assume that's a code word. I have to decide whether this is a safe enough environment to reveal that I'm gay. And then he rattled off a whole list of things that I've taken for granted. I was like, I've got some kind of privilege, which is not the right answer. The right answer is, because I didn't know I had any. The right answer is, and how do I use my privilege to level the playing field? And that's what the real issue is. And for you as faculty, how are you going to be able to determine what's going on with the people in your classrooms so that you can level the playing field?
In the interest of time, because I do want to get to questions, is there any particular slides that we want to go? Maybe
Okay, well, we're about halfway. We're doing good. We'll talk faster.
15 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Is this you or me?
You can start.
Okay. It's the whole notion that, good example for this one. It's the notion where people assume that your success is based on who you are and what you bring your success is based on what you bring to the table as opposed to what you look like. So this is connected to things associated with affirmative action. Okay, the whole idea that when people say, oh, you got here because you got an affirmative action scholarship. No, I actually got here because I have good grades, because I deserve to be here. And somebody thought, oh, people who look like me aren't getting opportunities, so let's level the playing field. So it's the whole notion of if you are given something, it somehow diminishes your merit for being there.
Really quickly, when it comes to this particular slide, pathology the cultural values and communication styles, it's really upon this idea that there's only one way of communicating information or knowledge, and usually that comes from, at least historically, from a Eurocentric perspective. Unless it follows this particular tradition, then it's not considered to be valid. A good way to think about it is disciplines. I'm not sure of the faculty, which departmentship you're in, but if you were to do a particular type of research, or engage in a particular type of research, is this idea that either it could be the department or the institution may not value it because it doesn't deal with this population. It's kind of like this idea that the research that you may engage in doesn't fall into or fit with what we think is valid or credible research.
It speaks to the notion, and we didn't spend as much time on theory, like critical race theory and intersectionality, which our written work really speaks to, but it's really about the notion that if we don't include people who are varied and diverse, we're not getting a full picture. The other thing is, I'm sorry, I gotta make you go back to that. Okay, the other thing that happens in a classroom setting, I'm raised so that you look at somebody in the face. Many other people aren't raised that way. Many people are raised that you don't look up to authority figures. Okay, so when I was in the field in social work, I had many students, so many social workers would write, Johnny does not make eye contact, Johnny is unable to be social. I'm like, Johnny was raised that you don't look up to somebody. That doesn't mean he doesn't make eye contact. Don't make something pathological that is really cultural. It doesn't mean that we excuse things that are pathological. It doesn't mean that we ignore things like mental health issues. But let's not assume that our way is the only way that is a healthy response. I'm sorry, I know you told me to hurry up, but I don't like that example. Okay, so we've been doing this for a while, and we have this list of tools. Do you want to start?
Sure. So one of the ideas is, okay, we talked about some of what the literature talks about relative to microaggressions. We talked about some examples, experiences in terms of specifically how Sue et al. Have identified different forms and experiences of microaggression. Now what do we do? We are in the classroom, we are on a college campus. How do we become more cognizant of what we're doing, and as we're interacting with colleagues as well as students, to make sure that we are more inclusive? When we talk about the term inclusive, that we're really inclusive and that we're more cognizant of how our actions, whether what we say or what we do, how that may impact other people. So one is about being self-aware. There is something about being self-aware. I know that, I don't know who's a social worker in the room or teachers in that area, but as social workers, we talk about being self-aware. You have to be aware of what you say and how you say it, how you're interacting with students, making the assumptions about certain things so that we are more cognizant, so that we don't, it's not so much that we're trying to, because sometimes you can't prevent a microaggressive experience, but it's all also about how do you react to that. If someone says something to you that you said something that I thought I took offense to it, it's also how do you respond to it. It can't just be a brushing off that, oh, what you felt isn't valid, right? It's not real. So it's about also not just being aware of how we interact, but also how we respond to those interactions.
My secret mission is that we stop trying to be culturally sensitive, and that we try to be culturally relevant, culturally informed, and have cultural humility, which means that we're open to understanding that there is other, and that it's not right or wrong, it's just that there's other. But that requires us to be honest with ourselves about what our own stuff is, because we all have it. The fact that we're here, that we're doing this, doesn't mean that we don't bring our own stereotypes about things to the table. So we have to at least be honest with ourselves, because if we're not, then we can't do the rest of it.
So we have 10 minutes, so
Okay.
we're going to just skip to the ones that you think is
looking
most.
at their clock says we've got 15 minutes.
Nancy just told me 10 minutes.
Okay.
So pick the ones that you think are most important and
Okay.
we'll skip.
Balance the teachable opportunity. If you ignore, okay, so when I supervise social workers doing trauma treatment and something happened that they felt like they missed, I said the good news is that if it is a theme, it will come back. So if you feel like you missed it, play it out in your head. Think about what you'd like to have done, because the opportunity will come back. If you ignore it or you try to render it invisible, because sometimes when things happen in classrooms or uncomfortable, like if I just like act like it didn't happen, it'll go away, nobody will know it, and I can make it doesn't go away. You as the leader have the responsibility to facilitate, and sometimes facilitation really is, that was uncomfortable, and I'm not sure if we can deal with this 2 minutes before class is over, but I want to recognize that it happened. That gives you a way to respond without upping the ante, especially if people are getting ready to walk out the door, going to somebody else's classroom, and having whatever could be a hostile take. So consider how you can just recognize and acknowledge without raising or lowering the intensity, depending on what your goal is. The other thing is, overkill is just as bad as under-responding. So you want, the trick here is all about balance. And I'm sorry, I gotta do one after, I'm sorry.
Okay.
You've got to create safety for the messiness of this conversation. If you're having conversations because it's in your classroom curriculum, because dynamics come up, you've got to create an environment that makes it safe for people to ask questions in a way that's genuine. And so it puts the ownership, I think, on us to set the tone, but also to set boundaries and parameters. And I think that that's tricky, because not everybody does what you're doing here, which is talking about how do we talk about this stuff. And so, to us, this is a beginning conversation. In our area, we're paying attention to how do we deal with race in the classroom. How do we deal with if we only have a person who's one person from that group and other people are really piling on? How do we deal with discussing race if you're the only, if you're a black person in a room versus if you're a white person in the room? I have a colleague who we teach diversity. She's a white woman who's older than I am, and we're going to do a couple of classes together because we have found that people will say different things to each of us because they make presumptions about us individually, and we want them to get to a place where they can talk genuinely and honestly without being pejorative about issues that they have. I'm sorry, that's as fast as I can go.
To tie up this particular part, then we're gonna open it up to questions, because if we want to make sure that there's time for that, is just to add to the point around the messiness around these types of conversations. When we're talking about race and class, and sexuality and gender and disabilities, it is an uncomfortable conversation. And arguably, it should be. We are not all the same. And being different does not mean that we can't all function and teach together, be colleagues as together, and interact with our students effectively. Having uncomfortable conversations, I would hope, is something that we can have in a college classroom to where we can still allow other voices or other points of view be heard without it necessarily being a judgment. Or as a means of folks feeling uncomfortable, they just say, we're not gonna have this conversation at all. Having these conversations, I think, are messy. It can be uncomfortable. And I would say to some degree, at least for the purposes of the presentation, if there is a particular topic that's being covered and I'm not familiar with, I should be able to go to my colleague and say, you know what, we're talking about this, I really don't know that much about it, can you give me some input? And that should be something that we do. That should be something that we do in an effort to help to make sure that we have a more inclusive classroom and campus.
5 minutes.
Okay, right. So with that being said, we do appreciate you attending. We appreciate your being engaged and being attentive. And now we would like it, just for the purposes of time, to open it up if folks have individual questions. Nancy's going to moderate if folks have questions for us.
I want to acknowledge Professor Soto, who is the chair of the Affirmative Action Committee. And so, questions, feedback, comments? Excellent, outstanding presentation. In case, for whatever reason, you don't want to ask your question out loud, write it in a Post-it and I'll come around.
Gotta have at least one question, right?
Like we were almost out of here without a question. This isn't necessarily a comment. I was thinking about this morning. I've had 3 student athletes in 3 different classes. One was a woman, 2 were men. They were all underperformers. And I was hoping one of them would break out and break this stereotype or whatever you call it. And none of them did. And so I've definitely started to form a different opinion. I had a more positive opinion about student athletes, and now it's going more negative based on what do you do when you find yourself making up, okay, now I've made up my mind about student athletes. After only 3 students. What's like a way out of that, I just thought of it this morning, so I just thought I'd share it.
So it's a good thing to share because there are student athlete scholars as well, and you didn't get those 3.
Right.
So hypothetically, if you had gotten 3 who acted like student athlete scholars, you'd have the other frame of reference.
Sure.
I think that the work needs to be done with the athletic department. I think the conversation with the folks who really do the work with the students may be helpful because A, you may not be privy to some of the pressures that they're having, and I kind of feel like athletic departments have a responsibility to coordinate with faculty and say, just so you know, this is our busy season. It's not that we're expecting you to give our students, an easy pass, but if they could have their assignment earlier or so forth, there may be some actual things that could happen that's more supportive to students, and there may not be, and it may be just that you got the 3 that you got. But I think the bigger issue is when we get sort of more than one person behaving the same way, it's easy for us to think everybody behaves the same way. And that can happen in many different constellations. So good that you identified it, and even better if you talk to somebody who has a closer relationship with those students.
Okay.
Well, I just want to say thank you for this presentation. It was really informative. And it was just more of a comment. I think that, everyone refers to CUNY as this super diverse university system, right? And even in CUNY classrooms, there's microaggressions against students of color or anyone in general. And I found this very informative, and it made me realize how many times I've been microaggressed without even realizing it. And I just hope that other CUNY colleges really try to have these same presentations in professional development for staff and faculty, because we really don't want to disencourage a student from going to school because of these aggressions, which oftentimes is the reason why they feel like they can't even finish their degree.
And we can be guilty of that as well.
I just want to say thank you again for your presentation. So yeah, I agree with you. At CUNY, we're a very diverse school system, right? I think one of the shortcomings of being such a diverse school system is we kind of it make the diversity invisible in certain ways, right? We don't acknowledge this diversity. We sometimes, because I always wonder, like, we're in a school where there's so many immigrants, but we never talk about immigration, right? We never really talk about, you never see people having like days where immigrants and immigration day. You might have services, but you never have a celebration, right? And so I say that because I do research in immigration, but anyway, that's a whole thing. So, but it's something that happens a lot when there's there's the space provides for that as well. That's therefore one of the things of the affordability of the space. But my other comment is that, and you were saying about the classrooms, but I think classrooms are spaces for disruption, right? Borrowing from Paulo Freire's notion, right, of pedagogy of the oppressed. Now, education is emancipatory, right? It's not something that keeps the status quo in the system going. So as educators, it's kind of on us as well to find ways to disrupt students' already existing stereotypes, their own beliefs about themselves, their own, stereotypes they think other people have of them, right? It becomes part of our responsibility. It is what we do. It's just finding the ways to do that empowers them rather than actually puts them back in the same position that they were in, a worse off position. And even as a psychologist, you never want people to be worse off than when they meet you than before they met you, right? And so I think about that all the time in my class, and I think about how to make it more inclusive, how to talk about this idea of culture. And I think what you brought across here about microaggressions is that it's more that intersectionality needs to be brought into the space. The classroom is an intersectional space. Yeah, and for us, we need to figure out how to bring that intersectionality forward, right?
Experiential opportunities
Yeah.
of cultural immersion in the classroom.
Right.
That's the way to do it. Experiential opportunities of cultural immersion in the classroom. Having the chance for people to talk about who they are, what their values are, what they like about their culture, what they don't like about their culture, what kinds of biases have they experienced. It's amazing how it levels the playing field. How people who look different, who come from different backgrounds, have some similar values and connect in ways that we never imagined. And people who have never been asked about who they are.
Right. Exactly. And a part of it, another thing is to add on to that is the validation. That who you are is worthy. That who you are a worthwhile person. And I think that's something that's, some of our students never hear.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I worked at a predominantly white institution where typically faculty of color got lower ratings in terms of their teaching than faculty of color. So than white faculty. So my question to you is, do you feel that this is typical because the academy has failed to legitimize the intellectual work of people of color and integrate it in a way that it is used as often as Eurocentric research and historical studies so that students do respect it equally to the Eurocentric research resources.
There is a great book called Race in the College Classroom. And it is written by faculty from 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, and it's just as like they each do a chapter, and it's basically their experiences of teaching. And the same thing you just talked about. Brenda said, I love this conversation because I'm really interested in doing more research relative to this particular topic. One of the issues is one about kind of like the idea that we were talking about before. You're here only because you're a woman, or you're here only because you're Latino, you're here only because you're black. So you're not really a faculty member who really deserves this spot. Your research isn't that good. That's the assumption. This is the idea is that you don't really deserve to be here. You're just here, and we kind of tolerate it. But when it comes to how we really include you in the department, it may not be in the way that really makes you part of the department, if that makes sense.
That speaks to the fact that the academy is not legitimizing the scholarly work of people of color.
But it's both and.
Right, and the research that they have done and the resources that are available for students to read, they're typically not included in the syllabi or, available to students as such.
I think it's the one about the research part. The other part too, which is going to be interesting in terms of how you can really study that, is whether who you are standing in front of the room, whether I look at you as worthy to be able to teach me to begin with. Do you have enough experience? Do I think that not so much that you can't teach necessarily, it's really about whether I think that what you're saying, whether I really want to believe what you're saying. And it's kind of like the idea that I can say it, and a person who is of a different racial or gender background, they say it, they may get the assumption that, oh, that could be true, but then once I say it or another person of color says it, that may not be true, so therefore your ratings are affected based upon that. Not so much that you're not doing the work or teaching effectively.
The other thing is that faculty who aren't tenured always feel more vulnerable than faculty who are tenured, and I think that goes across the board. I, for one, don't want to be tolerated. I think tolerance is a very low bar. Take me or leave me. But don't tolerate me. I'm sorry, I was raised Catholic. If you don't want me up there in heaven, send me to hell. Don't let me hanging out in purgatory. I also just want to add the notion, when we say the academy, it takes the responsibility away from the people. And in fact, some of this has to be bottom up. Some of it comes from students, some of it comes from your colleagues, some of it comes from your department. And when faculty are creating knowledge in their profession, it should be reflected in the syllabi of that school. I'm actually really pleased that in our department, we are a department that has to go through accreditation. And we look at all the syllabi. And we look to see what has been written from diverse, different groups, and what have we produced that belongs on the syllabi. And then, of course, it makes you have to be comfortable with using your own stuff. I've gone to classes where people have written books, and the only thing they've done is their book. I'm like, I never do that. But then I have to at least be comfortable using some of the stuff that I've written. We wrote an article about this. You all should know that. I brought the journal. Okay. I'm the co-editor of a journal on urban social work. In the entire country, there wasn't a journal on urban social work. And people use urban as a catchword for people of color, as opposed to paying attention to geography, to space, and to other issues that impact people who live in city environments. So somebody in this esteemed university should put our journal in your library so that it could be sustainable. And more importantly, those of you who are faculty should be writing and submitting to journals and to other scholarly endeavors so that the knowledge that you're developing can be heard and seen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.